The Sophists. Today we're going to talk about the Sophists. In order to understand the Sophists, we're going to need a little bit of history. We haven't gone over the history of Greece since the first episode of this, so I'm going to catch you up a little bit. Due to a series of circumstances, mainly because of the Persian invasion, which in the end, due to another series of circumstances, Athens basically thwarted and then saved all of Greece. So Athens enters a golden age. They were the foremost intellectual, military, and trade power in Greece. This was the age where citizens were expected to take concern in the city's politics. So this meant that there was a demand for education, so that this would train citizens in making a difference in this system. And this demand for education in this flourishing period was fulfilled by the Sophists. They were essentially freelance tutors. They specialized in rhetoric and the arts of persuasion. They're very skillful in debate and navigating politics to get what they want. They taught many other things, but this was sort of what they were best known for, and they were most groundbreaking for the following reason, because the Sophists demonstrated again and again with their rhetoric and their effective persuasion of democratic bodies that they could construct a, quote, logos for either side of an argument, and no one could tell the difference of which side was more sensible. This is sort of bad for law. The Sophists were frequently described as, quote, making the weaker argument the stronger, because they could argue convincingly that everything's in flux, or they could turn around and argue that nothing changes. So-and-so is guilty, or so-and-so isn't guilty. We should do gun control, or we should do the Second Amendment, pro-life, pro-choice, so on. They can argue perfectly convincingly for either side of an argument. This is, the Sophists could convince you logically either way, leaving you with nothing but your personal conviction and your disposition. So that's kind of what it was like in Greece once people began to realize this. And this is what they're teaching the upcoming generation, so that you can navigate politics, because now you can sway a democratic body, a less educated democratic body, one way or the other. And it's all a matter of who's better at rhetoric, who's the better sophist. This is huge, because it means the collapse of all previous philosophy. As far as the Sophists are concerned, we cannot be certain of anything, which is actually kind of going back to Xenophanes, but it's even more than that, because Xenophanes said, well, we can be pretty sure through observation and stuff, and through reason, but the Sophists are saying that they're even breaking that down to a certain degree. We can't even approach with any confidence any absolute truth. We can't even approach it. Because they've shown over and over how reasoning is inadequate to the task. So what are we left with? We're left with our personal disposition and the majority vote. The best we have, say the Sophists, is social convention. What society decides is right is what is right. The best of the Sophists, Protagoras, put it this way, quote, man is the measure of all things. That is, being cut off from the truth, we are the ultimate arbitrators of what is true. It was into this situation that the most famous Western philosopher of history arose. His name was Socrates. In his time, Socrates was evidently confused with or associated with the Sophists, mainly because of his sophist-like methods. However, there is a clear and fundamental difference between Socrates and the Sophists, in that Socrates was never a relativist, but he employed his skills in a search for truth and wisdom independent of popular opinion. The story goes that an acquaintance of Socrates, possibly as a joke, went to the divine oracle at Delphi and inquired whether there was any man wiser than old Socrates. And she replied, to everybody's surprise, nobody is wiser than Socrates. Upon hearing this answer, Socrates was astonished, because as far as he was concerned, he was not the wisest person ever, and unsatisfied, set about Athens to find somebody, anybody, who was wiser than himself in order to prove the oracle wrong. And he would do this by approaching many sophists or political leaders or civic officials who were the sophist students and asking them questions about what they claimed to teach or believe. And these inquiries always led to show that the fellow Socrates hoped was wise actually didn't know what he was talking about and show it before an audience of curious citizens. Not exactly good for public image, and eventually, apparently, the fellow who Socrates was inquiring of would hastily extricate himself from said inquiry and leave in a rather vengeful huff. And meanwhile Socrates would be left standing there and came to the conclusion that he was not wise because of any personal wisdom of his own, but because he was the only man humble enough to know that he was ignorant, while the men he questioned were ignorant of their own ignorance. And that is why Socrates was the wisest man in Athens, because he's the only one who knew that he didn't necessarily know anything, which is hilarious, because the Sophists constantly claimed that we can't be certain of anything. But the only one who actually practiced that was Socrates, and he practiced it by constantly trying to find a truth, because he couldn't be certain that there wasn't any truth. Now, as you can imagine, despite his legitimately humble attitude, Socrates was notorious for his biting sarcasm, especially when questioning the proud Sophists. You get the idea that he kind of got fed up with the Sophists sometimes and would sort of make fun of them and enjoy making fools out of them in front of the audience. He was not so innocent or naive as some people have sort of made him out to be. He was definitely known for his shrewdness and his perfect willingness to publicly embarrass people. But he was harmless, and people did like him. And it was also clear that Socrates was seeking truth, as I said. And there are several claims that he found that he believed resembled the truth. One, all men ought to search for truth and examine how they are living and question it and seek to care for the soul, sort of like Xenophanes had said. Number two, righteousness is equal to knowledge or understanding, because if a man truly understands what is good, then he will do it. This is what Socrates believed. Hence, why we must honestly examine our life and what we think we know. Because if we don't know something, then we're more likely to make mistakes and be wicked in that sense. Number three, goodness is self-sufficient, because it lies entirely in one's personal understanding of the world, or one's soul. What you do to a man's body cannot harm his soul, unless he has chosen evil of himself. So these are some of the main ideas that we can attribute to Socrates himself. You'll notice that Socrates is not concerned with the metaphysical questions that his predecessors were, such as Parmenides and Zeno and the Atomists. He's much more practically and down-to-earth concerned. This is what he's sort of known for. He's very ethically concerned, you'll notice. He's concerned with the ethical implications of metaphysical theories, not really the theories themselves. In fact, in the Phaedo, he talks about how he used to be interested sort of in that stuff, but he lost interest because he felt that it didn't have anything to do with the meaning of life. It only had to do with what life was made out of. So it's interesting. Though you can imagine how Socrates was not particularly popular. So as you can imagine, Socrates became none too popular with the Athenian leadership and some of the citizenry. It is important to note that Socrates' heyday was at a time of crisis. As I was saying earlier, Athens was very prominent in Greece, but their prominence was being challenged when Socrates was around by Sparta and some of the other jealous states who finally got kind of tired of Athens saying that it was top dog, and they finally beat Athens into submission, and this was called the Peloponnesian War. Afterwards, the Spartans instituted a council over Athens, which was later called the 30 Tyrants, who evidently executed about 5% of Athens' population before their overthrow 13 months after their appointment. So they execute 5% of the population in 13 months. You got to hand it to them. They are darn efficient. The Spartans allowed for the reinstatement of Athenian democracy, but by now the citizens were rather disillusioned or jaded with democracy's power to protect them because it failed them in the war. And then you had the 30 Tyrants, who were supposed to be a democratic council, sort of, not really. In this political imbalance, a supposed sophist making fools of state leadership was not welcome, and Socrates was brought to trial on trumped-up charges of seditious activity. Unimpressed by the state's actions, Socrates then proceeded in his court trial to question and inquire his prosecutors just like he would on the streets, and demonstrated their fallacies again. And then he proposed that the best punishment for him was free room and board for life at the place that normally housed Olympic heroes for performing a public service, because his public service was getting people to wake up intellectually and consider improving their lives. He actually described himself as a gadfly who would sting the horse of Athens into waking up by going around and stinging its public officials by saying that you don't know what you're talking about. And so now they were swatting the gadfly, which I'm sure is a part of the imagery there. But in any case, they were not particularly impressed by his behavior in the courtroom, and they sentenced him to death by poison. And that's where the term drinking the hemlock comes from, because that's what ultimately he did. And just a side note, just to give you another bit of the picture of the character of Socrates, according to Plato, and it's very, very likely this did indeed happen, that there was an opportunity, a perfect opportunity, for Socrates to escape prison where he was being held waiting for his execution, but he refused to escape. And the reason being that why would I escape? I just allowed myself to be put on trial and allowed myself to be sentenced. If I were to escape and basically deny that sentence, then that would throw into question everything I'd been doing beforehand. Because if I didn't believe that it was just for me to be put to trial by a country that I have decided that I am going to stay and live in despite current events, if I then were to run away from it, then I'd basically be saying that my search for truth and my search for justice wasn't really all that sincere. I just think that that's a very interesting portrayal of Socrates. So next time, the death of Socrates sort of ignited, rather than quelling, it ignited a powder keg of philosophical activity. Socrates really did sort of change philosophy from that point. We've gone through the pre-Socratics. They're literally called that, the pre-Socratics, because after Socrates everything changes. And so we're going to go through a few of the followers of Socrates directly after him, as well as Plato, who was the most famous and the most influential philosopher probably of all time. So that will be next time. I hope you've enjoyed this particular video. Put any comments, questions, criticisms in the comments below. Let me know if I know what I'm talking about or not. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you.